This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host Renee Williams. And today in studio we have Dr. Gabriel Karns, and he's a faculty member of the Terrestrial Wildlife Ecology Lab in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. And it's a pleasure to have you in studio today.
It's great to be here.
And today we're going to be talking about wildlife and wildlife habitat relationships, particularly looking at vegetation management on those pipeline rights-of-ways. And before we get started talking about your research, tell us a little bit about your background and what you do at Ohio State University.
Yeah, I've been at Ohio State for 6 years now. I moved there from my completion of PhD at Auburn University. Came up there to work on a Division of Wildlife project as a postdoc, and they couldn't make me leave. So I've worked on a number of things since, but the last several years really looking at working the landscapes and how we can work closer with industry to achieve greater positive conservation outcomes.
So what first got you interested in wildlife?
It's hard to recall because it was so early. I was one of those
always
kids,
wildlife.
Right?
Yeah. One of those
6
kids.
years old, your aunt asks you, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a wildlife scientist. And I'll be darned.
Here you are.
Here I am. So,
good.
Yeah, fairy tale.
Well, thank you for providing that information on your background, and we really appreciate you being here. And you're here at UK to do a seminar in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and your seminar is going to be on, or it's titled, Using a Multi-Taxa Lens to Understand Conservation Potential for Industrial Management on Pipelines Rights-of-Ways. And so we wanted to take the opportunity while you were here at UK and talk a little bit about your research, tell our listeners about some of the stuff that you're doing on your research. I guess we'll go ahead and start on the topic. Tell us a little bit about what your research is about.
A little bit more background about our school. The school is the environment and natural resources, which implies both sort of a preservation, keeping it whole, keeping integrity intact, but also natural resources, recognizing that there's resources in the landscape that are sustainable if we come at it from a sort of conservation-centric perspective. Looking at the region, particularly within the state, early successional habitat is shrinking, both in terms of quantity as well as the quality.
And can you describe a little bit to our listeners what early successional habitat would look like?
Yep, so to the human eye, early successional habitat is generally not the most attractive thing you've ever looked at. So think shrubby, scrubby, a regenerating timber harvest. Members of the general public have been known to call these places eyesores, but there are a host of wildlife species that depend upon those habitat conditions. And because society is changing, more people are living in cities, we're heating our homes with gas and electric, there's less timber harvest activity, forests are growing older and not being returned into those early successional stages. We've had to be a little bit creative in terms of where we look to get that habitat that so many wildlife species depend on.
And what are some of the wildlife species that depend on it kind of in this region?
So the Wildlife Management Institute several years ago launched a Young Forest Initiative, and they sort of hung their hat on 3 species from the Northeast, the New England cottontail, swinging down into sort of the New York, Pennsylvania region, the golden-winged warbler, and then moving into the Appalachians and Ohio and then back around into Michigan, American woodcock. And those are 3 fairly recognizable species. WMI decided, hey, if we can craft habitat management guidelines to address those 3 species, there's a cascade of species that fall under those umbrellas for what we can say, hey, and we also created beneficial conditions for those.
Tell us a little more about what you're going to talk about in your seminar.
So in looking for those, perhaps we'll call it unconventional places to do habitat management, a couple places jump out. And many of those share a common characteristic in that they're linear corridors. So whether that's roadside medians and shoulders, overhead utility lines, in my case, underground utilities, moving oils and gas across the landscape from a well location to a refinery to a final product. Those are part and parcel of the eastern United States landscape, and for too long, I think the scientific community has tolerated is probably even too kind of a word. They've viewed those landscapes solely as mechanisms of fragmentation, reducing forest core. I'm not saying that those things are not true, but really deaf to the idea that those landscapes may also present some conservation potential if we work with industry to help them meet their goals, which are related to moving products safely, keeping access open in case of emergency, and using that nexus as a unique opportunity to do conservation through habitat management.
And so how do you work with the companies to let them know about, best practices or things to do on those rights of ways?
It's tricky. It's easiest when it occurs top down. So shameless plug for the Rights of Way as Habitat Working Group. It's a collaborative group of energy sector, transportation, State Department of Transportation offices, some universities, but then a lot of sort of conservation organizations such as Pheasants Forever, who they're still Pheasants Forever, but a lot of what PF does now could almost be framed as Pollinators Forever. They've done a really good job of making pheasant habitat relevant to 100% of the American populace through sort of recrafting some of what they portray through the lens of pollinator habitat. And again, the working group's name, Rights of Way as Habitat, speaks to this opportunity that the working group has seized upon, and when there's energy sector representatives present in that room, you can achieve large-scale effects through a vegetation management system. On the other side, in a state like Ohio, which is highly private, we have just under 3% public lands, and where most of the utility corridors land on private lands, in that highly fragmented landscape, at least from an ownership standpoint, oftentimes partnering with an industry also requires getting that landowner on board. And he or she may only own 10 or 40 or 400 acres. And 400 acres sounds like a lot until you think, but yeah, Pennsylvania or West Virginia, which is far more rich in public lands, they can top down and enact change across a 78,000 acre. And I think Kentucky, portions of Kentucky are uniquely blessed with lots of public land as well. So that land ownership landscape is also a difficult thing to navigate when you're talking about scaling best management practices.
And do you work with the individual landowners, or are you more working with the companies that have to deal with the landowners?
Because 4 years ago when I was getting into this space, I did not have many contacts in the sector space. I did take a bottom-up approach, so working through Division of Forestry, service foresters, through the wildlife specialists in the soil water conservation districts, looking for landowners who wanted to achieve and set objectives to address wildlife populations, wildlife habitat. We started there, and of course you had to have a right-of-way. We screened those lands for matching up to our study design criteria, and if we checked all our boxes, then we would reach out to the Marathon Petroleum or Mark West or whomever the case may be. And in most cases, once those companies were assured that the private landowner was on board and what we were proposing would not in any way interfere with safe transportation of those products across the landscape, they were more than happy to let us do research on those plots and sites.
Okay. And what did your research find? I mean, what are the practices that they should be doing? Or
the project overall examined the role of integrated vegetation management and its potential in creating better habitat conditions across the landscape. So to make sense of integrated vegetation management, and I think going forward I'll just say IVM, because it's less of a mouthful. It helps to understand sort of the status quo of how rights of ways typically were managed, at least when thinking about pipeline corridors. Woody encroachment is bad because woody shrubs and trees have roots, and roots do not necessarily get along good with pipes.
Makes sense.
Makes sense.
So in talking about overhead utility lines, you can tolerate shrub-scrub habitat. You can even tolerate low height growing trees. But pipeline rights of ways are a unique case in which essentially there's an opportunity there to restore quote-unquote grassland-like conditions. It just happens to be in a linear strip configuration. I'll make a fairly big deal about it here in an hour and a half, but suffice it to say, the opportunity of doing habitat in rights-of-ways is not without its challenges. So what we know about creating habitat along edges, nest parasitism through brown-headed cowbirds, increased in nest predation, a host of other impacts come along and challenges have to be negotiated. But again, this was sort of unexplored space in coming at the rights-of-way. How do we manage vegetation within rights-of-way and looking at it as an opportunity? Circling back around, most of the pipeline corridors in Ohio, at least associated with the recent unconventional fracking methods accessing shale deposits in both the Marcellus and Utica shale plays, those rights-of-way are not older than 8 or 10 years, which means succession has not advanced those rights-of-way to the point of, ooh, wow, we have a really egregious problem and we need to be heavy-handed and eliminate the woody encroachment that's occurred. Things had not progressed to that standpoint, and a lot of the status quo management was periodic mowing, most often annually. Any good golf course manager will tell you his most effective way to keep weeds out of the fairway is to mow 3 times a week, or 4, right? If the weather permits. Just like your lawn. How well manicured your lawn is inversely proportional to the amount of time you spend pulling dandelions. The trick is this. What is weeds to a golf course manager often has a floral resource that a grass-dominated landscape does not. And when we start talking about native warm season grasses or herbaceous forbs, such as wildflowers, you're not only getting a payoff in terms of flowering resources, such as pollen or nectar, but you're also creating a landscape with more structural complexity, more places for different wildlife species to call home. So an overarching goal of IVM is, rather than having on the calendar, on August 27th, every year in perpetuity we show up with our brush hogs and we mow, that's maintenance. That's regularly scheduled maintenance. IVM, the M stands for management, which plays into themes common with adaptive management, right? We're going to go in and assess. We're going to look in our toolbox, whatever the best tool happens to be. We're going to apply that. We're going to monitor afterwards. We're going to hopefully learn something so next time back we can do something a little bit better, a little bit different. Well, that little bit different could look like mowing just at a better time of year. So the Monarch joint venture has mowing guidance that if you're going to mow, it makes sense when that mowing practice would not impact the milkweed resource that monarchs need to get back to those mountains in Mexico every fall. Or different might look like, hey, rather than mowing, we can use herbicides that affect incompatible vegetation. And you can define incompatible depending on your landscape. So if you're on pipeline rights-of-way, chances are that's anything woody. Johnson grass would also be an incompatible because it's so high that it impedes visibility, sight lines down that corridor. And that's actually, those white and or yellow pylon markers that you see on pipelines. There is an enforced regulation that you need to be able to stand at one pylon and see downrange to the one to your north, as well as backwards to the one at your south. So something like Johnson grass, which may crest out at 8, 9, 10 feet tall, that's going to impede that sight line. Now milkweed, which would never get an opportunity to colonize a corridor that's regularly mowed, selective herbicide chemistry applied out of a backpack, we're talking ounces of active ingredient to the acre, and it's actually economical as well to scale. Milkweed would be competitive within that landscape, and it doesn't take much of an imagination to see where that payoff would be when we're talking about wildlife.
Okay. So how long did you conduct your research before you actually started giving presentations on it? Long time.
Define presentation. I would say that every time I interacted with a landowner or pitched this idea to an industry, we were presenting sort of our pre-study hypotheses and predictions about what we would see. That said, about 18 months, it was after we had collected 1 year pre-treatment data, and then we've been collecting post-treatment data for several years now, sort of from that pre to post switch, because quite honestly, the data out there for underground utility rights-of-way in Ohio, in the Midwest at large, it was interesting data just to say these species were utilizing these landscapes. So whether I'm talking about butterflies or native bees, snakes or salamanders, neotropical migrant, songbirds, that was all relevant and interesting information, which was a contribution in and of itself.
Do you know how many acres or miles of rights-of-way you have in your study area?
In our study area, we have about 45 acres of plots. And essentially that's about 24 plots, anywhere from 1.5 acres to 2.5 acres. And sort of that variation reflects differing right-of-way widths. That said, that is a percent of 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 the rights-of-way corridors in Ohio. And when we're talking about the national scale, those numbers are staggering.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So if there's kind of landowners here in Kentucky that have land with, do they have land with rights of ways that cross over them? If they were interested in doing something different, do they need to contact the company that manages that, or is that something they need to do, or where can they go to find more information?
Where do they start?
Yeah, what's next for them?
It depends.
Okay.
That said, a landowner's best chance to make his or her desires heard and incorporated into how that corridor is going to be managed is when that initial easement agreement is being struck. So incorporating a more wildlife-friendly seed mix, which may be less of those cool season forages, more of a wildflower component. Less of those white clovers or lespedizas or bird's foot trefoil, which tend to form pretty monotypic, very dense stands, and more, but fewer in proportion, wildflower options. That's one thing. Another is insisting that mowing is done at the right time of year. So first week of June, probably not a good time. Grassland bird species that have adapted to utilize those linear landscapes as nesting substrates, brush hog, nest, doesn't mix. Mowing those in September, late September, also not a good idea. That's when those monarchs, that fourth generation, is doing its best to get back down to Mexico. And if there's milkweed present within that landscape, which in a lot of cases there are, surprising number of instances there are, even when milkweed was not in the seed mix, that would be a bad time to mow. In our study, we looked at not only in right-of-way vegetation, but we also explored a practice called edge notching. So an edge notch is essentially an attempt to take what may otherwise be a very hard, abrupt, severe edge, and oftentimes it looks as stark as, oh, that kind of looks like a golf course fairway, and look, it butts right up against mature forest. That is a hard, abrupt edge.
Right.
And likely not a quality edge viewed through the lens of many wildlife species, particularly early successional species. To the extent that that edge can be modified to create sort of a staggered height and structural complexity from low-growing grass or forbs to maybe native warm season grasses or wildflowers that are peaking out in the 6, 8, 10 foot range, and then maybe you have a little bit of a shrub zone, and then you get to the forest. In ecology, we would call that an ecotone. But essentially, you're softening that edge and giving more opportunities for niches, places where different wildlife species are going to find a home.
And would that be on the landowner's property or the right-of-way?
Usually the landowner's property, because the right-of-way company really only has a say in that easement. And that easement is only going to be 90, 100, 120 feet wide, depending on the circumstance. And as soon as you get to the woods, well, it's woods, which means that must not have been in the easement.
Right.
And there's also some cases in which those companies actually own that land. So, yeah, as long as the private landowner is working with the company to ensure, as they're perhaps felling some trees that don't have a high timber value and that don't have a high wildlife value, as long as those trees aren't felled out into the right-of-way to create an access impediment, so on and so forth, companies are generally amenable to that idea. If we even go back a little bit earlier, say someone shows up on your doorstep, we're entertaining the possibility that your back 40 will someday hold a right-of-way. Normal practice is to clear that land. Whatever trees were there will come down, which makes sense. But from there, often the option is, do you want us to stack things up? Maybe you want some firewood. Maybe there is some lumber value there. If you don't want that, we'll actually run it through a chipper and blow that mulch back into the woods. A solution that often saves the industry money, as well as leaves habitat on the ground, is, hey, rather than stack up all the trees, which if they're merchantable, sure, if you burn wood for heat, sure, but if that's not the case, rather than blow mulch into the woods, let's arrange those treetops in brush piles. And that can create some of those ecotonal transitional elements that wildlife depend on that are crucial and lacking within a landscape that's largely maturing forests where early successional habitat conditions are fewer and fewer within the landscape.
All right, well, you've presented us with a lot of great information, and we appreciate that. Do you have like maybe one or two takeaway items that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yes. Trying to sort out where to go with this. I think I'll get philosophical. If the natural world, if we could get in a time portal, come back in 100 years, if the natural world, 100 years from now, we show up on planet Earth and we're like, wow, things aren't nearly as bad as I thought they were going to be. It is going to mean that we figured out how to successfully do conservation in places where we do not do conservation well or at all now. And looking at these unconventional landscapes such as roadside medians and shoulders, pipeline, overhead utility corridors. In Kentucky, I don't want to get into whether or not the tops of mountains should be removed to extract natural resources, but given they are, they provide a very interesting form of habitat that is otherwise scarce within the landscape. And latching on to those opportunities that, quite frankly, the environmental community, the wildlife community, all too often has just wagged a finger at, rather than, maybe not the best, but given that it's there, we're going to choose to partner with you and try to do conservation a little bit better within those landscapes. I think in order for us to be pleased, or at least tolerable of what we find in 100 years, that will have to be the case.
Okay.
I'll end there.
Okay.
right.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for joining us today. And if you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Stay tuned now for another episode of Extension Notes. Thank you for tuning in to another version of Extension Notes. For those of you who haven't heard what Extension Notes is, it's a short segment on what our faculty and staff are doing that are in Extension. So today we're going to be touching on a couple of topics, the Woodland Owner Short Course and the Kentucky Forest Sector Economic Contribution Report. And here to speak about those is Billy Thomas. Thank you for coming in today. We appreciate it.
Hello, Renee, Laura. Thank you all for having me.
Yeah. So Billy is an extension forester in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And first of all, we're going to talk about the Woodland Owner Short Course. So tell us a little bit about what that is.
Sure. We've just made plans for our 2019 Kentucky Woodland Owner Short Course. And this is a program designed, as you would imagine, for woodland owners.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of them across the state. We really do. You know, nearly 500,000 woodland owners, give or take a few. And these landowners own their property for a wide variety of reasons. So we've put the Kentucky Woodland Owner Short Course together to connect woodland owners with a lot of the natural resource professionals that are out there that can help them manage their property. We also bring in experts that can talk on a wide variety of subjects that are important. So the way we plan these programs is we have local planning meetings in East, Central, and West Kentucky, and we design the programs really on regional needs. So the East Kentucky program is designed with East Kentucky woodland owners in mind, and some of the issues that they're facing, some of the species they have are a little bit different than what we have in other parts of the state. And likewise in Central Kentucky, they're dealing with a few issues that are different than other parts, region specific.
Thank
exactly.
you. Yes.
And likewise with West Kentucky, where we have a lot more agriculture, but we still have a lot of woodlands out there as well. So these programs are really tailored to the specific regions of Kentucky, and they're on a Saturday, and we have them coming up. The first one's on July 20th in Logan County, and then the next one's going to be on August 10th in Washington County, and then on August 24th we're going to wrap it up in Clay County in East Kentucky. So we start out in West Kentucky and we kind of work our way across the state every other Saturday starting basically July 20th. So I encourage landowners that are out there or people that have an interest in forestry and wildlife and natural resources to come and join us. It's a great opportunity to get a lot of information in a very short period of time. We load you up with a ton of resources, and really probably most importantly, we connect you with the professionals that can help you manage your property. So it's a really good opportunity for landowners to really get the most out of their woodlands.
So can you kind of describe what the Saturday looks like, from start to finish, what they do once they get there to the time that they leave?
Sure, that's a good point, Laura. It is a full-day program. It really is. And we start pretty early. We have registration start at 8:30, and we're at a local county extension office. So we're going to be in the Logan County Extension Office and the Washington County Extension Office, and then the Clay County, they have a Excel Center, which is a satellite extension office. But we'll start at each of those extension offices, so it's an easy place for people to find, and they'll come there, and then we'll have some exhibitors set up. We invite exhibitors that have information and activities and resources and programs that are relevant to woodland owners. They will be set up there, so it's an opportunity for people to come in as they register, get a cup of coffee, and check out some of our exhibitors and some of the information they have. And then we'll get started promptly at 9 o'clock. And at 9 o'clock, we'll kind of introduce them to the day, and we'll have a little game that we play. We call it the Woodland Game. And really, we use this as it's a little clickers that people are able to kind of respond to a presentation, and we ask them questions about their woodlands, and it's anonymous so people can freely answer, but it really kind of helps set the stage for that day in terms of where people's knowledge level are on a variety of topics. Our presenters are in the room, and they're kind of receiving that feedback as the audience responds to these questions, so it kind of gets us all on the same page, if you will. So the presenters know kind of where the landowner's knowledge is at, and the landowners get a sense for what the other landowners know as well. So we start there, we kind of get the day rolling with that, and then we go into basically split sessions at that point. So the way the Woodland Owner Short Course is set up, we have a green programming track for landowners that may be just getting started. They don't have a management plan. Maybe they just inherited their property. Maybe they don't even know that there's professionals out there that can help them. So the green track is really geared for that audience. And then we have what we call the gold track, and that's geared toward landowners that already have a woodland management site plan, maybe working with a professional, but are really looking to kind of ramp up their level of engagement and activity on their property. So regardless of kind of where you're at on that spectrum, I think there is a place for you to join us. So we'll do some indoor programming with one of those groups, and we'll cover a variety of topics. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later as we get a little closer to the date. And then the other group goes out to a nearby woodland owner's farm, and we tour some of the practices that they've done on their property. So it's always great to get landowners talking to other landowners and to be able to see the realities. You know, it's one thing for us to talk about do this and do that, but it's another thing when you go out to an actual farm and you see how it's actually implemented. So it gives landowners a chance to really see how that works. It also gives them a chance to interact with some of the professionals that they'll work with on their own property. And in many cases, if you're in that county or nearby, it may be the actual professional that you would work with. So you can make some connections that way. And then we'll all come back together and we'll have lunch at the extension office. And then basically we'll flip the groups in the afternoon. So if you were inside, then you'll go outside and vice versa. And then we wrap it up with a presentation on timber sales, timber harvesting, and trespass. We bring a consultant forester in to cover these topics. And I know many landowners may not be thinking that I'm ever going to harvest timber from their property. And that's okay. You don't have to. There's certainly no obligation that you have to harvest timber. But if you do, and as we've seen over the course of history, almost all woodlands are harvested at one point or another, we want you to do it well informed. And we want you to do it in a way that protects that woodland for the future. So we'll cover that information. And we'll send you home with a little thumb drive with about 700 different publications on woodland management, wildlife management, water, non-timber forest products, how to connect to all these professionals. So you really, not only do you get to meet some of these people, you end up taking home a lot of resources that you can then use to kind of do work on your own property. So for one day investment in your time, I think it will pay dividends for not only you, but for generations to come.
So can you, I think that's great information and a great program. And I know we've talked a little bit about this on some other shows, but why is it important for woodland owners to manage their land? You know, we may have some new listeners that are just tuning in, and so explain to them, you know, the land can grow, and
Sure.
you know, but why should they do something, or why should they know more?
You know, Laura, that's a good point. There was a time here in our history in Kentucky when really we could just kind of let the trees grow and not worry too much about them. And they would just do their thing, and then if we needed some, we would take some. But today, we really can't do that anymore. There are too many threats facing our woodlands today that we really didn't have in the past. We think about invasive plants. You know, bush honeysuckle here in central Kentucky has taken over. If you just do nothing with your woodlands and you're in central Kentucky, you're going to have a bush honeysuckle forest. I mean, that's just what's going to happen if you don't do something about that. So that's one example. That's a pressure that we didn't have before. And then you think about the emerald ash borer that's coming in, and there's a host of other insects. So our forests are being impacted by a number of threats that are new.
Yeah,
and
that
these,
weren't a long time ago.
right. So that warrants us to have to do something. So we really try to promote being active on your property, just so you'll be aware when these things are happening, because it's so much easier to control some of these issues if you get them early than let them kind of explode, and then you've got a really big problem. You know, wildfire is another issue. Many of our woods have been burned in Kentucky, and while they may green up in the spring and look okay, we have a lot of residual damage that's happened from those fires, and it really degrades those stands over time. So we want the landowners to realize now that just leaving your woods alone is probably really not a good option, and it's because of these new threats that we didn't have before. So that's why it's important to be active. It's important to know what's going on in your woods, and it's also important to be able to know who can help you address issues that you're dealing with. And one thing that landowners don't realize, or many don't, is that there's a lot of financial assistance available to help landowners actively manage their property. There's conservation money that's been set aside through the Farm Bill, which is a federal program that comes out every 5 years, and it does a wide variety of things. But one thing it does do is it sets aside funds for conservation-related practices to encourage landowners to do practices that conserve the natural resources that we have. And that program's in place because we recognize that if we have functioning, healthy ecosystems, especially in our forest forested systems that we all benefit. Society wins when our forests are healthy and able to provide many of the goods and services that we provide. So leaving them alone is not a good option anymore. It's really not. And that's unfortunate, but that is the reality we're facing.
And you mentioned some of the kind of the ecosystem services. Can you, again, just remind our listeners or those new listeners, let them know why our forests are so important?
Well, certainly I'm coming from a very biased standpoint, being a forester, and I think, trees are the answer to everything. But if you think about some of the benefits that our forests provide, some of those, and we'll talk about in a minute, some of the economic benefits are certainly important when you talk about jobs and some of the desks that we're sitting around today here, our homes, the wood that's in those homes, our floors, our cabinets, the paper we use. We use wood all the time, and we use wood a lot of times that we don't even realize we're using wood because it's in a lot of other products as well. So you got that part that's important, but the ecosystem services, those are really the kind of things that sustain our life. If you think about water quality, forested systems produce higher quality water, which results in less treatment costs, and it results in less problems with water quality down the line. So just from a water quality standpoint, our forests play a very important role in filtering that water, capturing some of those pollutants and some of those other things that really degrade water quality. So that's really important. We also think about kind of cleaning the air and providing cooling. Trees are amazing. If you're out on a field in a sunny day and then you walk under the shade of a tree,
a huge difference.
Right, and that really has a big impact. Certainly in our urban environments, trees are especially important there, providing cooling and keeping that urban heat island effect from being a problem. So that, the cooling effect, the air cleaning, pulling in a lot of that carbon and storing it in the wood is really important. So that's another ecosystem service that our forests provide. Another one that maybe gets overlooked sometimes is the habitat that our forests provide. There's countless number of species of flora and fauna that really call our forests home. And without our forests being healthy and functioning, their habitat is degraded. And so it hurts our biodiversity. And, the more diverse we are, probably the better off we are. So we want to retain all of our parts, and so we want to make sure that our forests are healthy and able to support a wide variety. So those are just a few examples of some of the services that often get overlooked when it comes to our forests. And the thing about those services is we all benefit from them. Not only that woodland owner that's doing things, but the people that are drinking the water that came from his property downstream, the people that are interested in looking at wildlife or hunting wildlife because that woodland owner is doing things to have a productive place, cooling the air, all those things are really important and reasons why the forests and trees provide so many ecosystem services.
So why don't we talk a little bit about that, since it sounds like we're moving into this report that we've created. So kind of explain what this is and what it touches on and why we do it.
Right. So since about 2012, the Forestry Extension team here at UK Department of Forestry and Natural Resources has been documenting the economic contribution of our forest sector here in Kentucky. And one of the things that's a challenge when it comes to kind of telling the story of how important forestry is that it's so diffuse. It's really spread out across the state. It's not like a car manufacturing facility like we have nearby in Georgetown, where it's really easy to see that impact, right? Or the Ford places that build trucks, or the Chevrolet that builds the Corvette down in Bowling Green. All those are really kind of finite and easy to kind of see, if you will. But when you talk about our forest industry, it's spread out all across the state. It's hard for people to understand and realize just how important our forests are from an economic standpoint. So we've tried to elevate that knowledge amongst everybody the best we can, that our forests are important, that they provide countless jobs across the state, and there's a lot of trickle-down things that happen from that. There's a lot of other businesses that are based on forest here in Kentucky. We provide a lot of jobs for loggers, sawmillers, but finished products and the paper manufacturing. So there's a wide variety of jobs that are out there that are tied directly to our forest sector. And from the economic contribution standpoint, it's really big what our forests provide in the forest industry. So we're trying to tell that story, and we're trying to do it because we think our forests are important, and we want to draw attention, and we want to draw resources to try to help protect and promote healthy forests here in Kentucky. So that's why we've been working on this economic contribution reporting for a while, to try to tell the story of how important our forests are and how important our forest industry is here in Kentucky.
And so how big is that?
It's really big. Okay? If you look at the way they do a lot of the economic contribution reporting, they talk about different kind of levels of contributions. So one level is like direct contribution, and that's an easy one to understand. That would be things like the sales from companies, what the products that they're selling. So that's like a direct contribution. The pay that goes to employees and stuff like that. It's really easy to see. But there's also kind of indirect, industries that may be supporting, the forest industry or supporting the loggers, restaurants and gas stations and doctors and all of those things. Right. If we don't have this workforce in place, then their capacity is diminished and their need is kind of lessened. And then we have these induced things. So as these people start spending that money that they got because of those relationships, it even kind of goes further and further. And so at some point it keeps getting, the impact starts lessening after some point, but it is really significant. If we look at the direct impact, it's about $8.5 billion on an annual basis here in Kentucky. That's huge.
That's huge.
That's one of our biggest industries here in the state. It really is. If you look at the total economic impact, which would include those indirect and induced effects, we're over $13 billion. So that's a lot of contribution that our forest sector plays here in Kentucky, and it helps all of us in a variety of ways. You look at the jobs, we have about 26,000 jobs that are directly tied to the forest industry here in Kentucky. And then if you kind of do that indirect and induced and to get that total impact, we're over 60,000 jobs that are, linked to our trees, our forests, and the forest industry that utilizes and processes them, and to useful products that we use every day. One of the great things about forests, they're renewable, right? If we manage them properly, we can renew them and make sure that they can provide those benefits in perpetuities.
Which kind of gets back to the Woodland Owner Short Course.
Exactly. So, and the thing about the Woodland Owner Short Course is almost all of the wood that's harvested here in Kentucky comes from private woodland owners. So they are really the beginning of that supply chain of the forest industry. Without the trees and the forests that we have here in Kentucky, this forest sector does not really exist as we know it. So they're all important. They really are.
So for those that are interested, we'll definitely post the economic impact report on our episode page. And then if they're interested in Woodland Owner Short Course, where do they go to get more information or to register? Sure.
And you can find both of those events or products and programs at our www.ukforestry.org. That's the easiest way to get there. And then you can just look through our programs, and we have a little button for our economic contribution report. You can see that well, and you can quickly get to both of those. I will say that we do have registration open for the 2019 Woodland Owner Short Course, so we encourage people to come. One thing I don't think I mentioned about it earlier is we really encourage couples to come if at all possible. And that couple could be a husband and wife, it could be two brothers, two sisters, it could be a father and a daughter, or whoever. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get the family involved in that forest, and we want the family to know what's going on, and we want the family to be active in that. And that's really important from kind of a legacy standpoint. Many of our woodland owners indicate to us that they want to kind of pass their property on to their children and to their heirs. Getting the kids involved early and frequently is really important for them to have that connection to those woodlands. So we encourage couples to come, and again, that could be husband and wife, or father and son, or mother and daughter, or whatever.
Couples, actually, they don't have to attend the same track.
That's a good point, Renee. Right. So we have those two programming tracks, and one of the challenges sometimes you're like, "Ooh, I want to do that," or "I want to do that." This way you can divide and conquer.
But they're in different tracks.
Yeah. So one could go to the green track and one could go to the gold track, and they can compare notes later and really get the whole breadth that we have to offer at the Woodland Owner Short Course. So I would really encourage your listeners to join us that are interested in woodlands or think they might be interested in maybe acquiring woodlands someday. Really making those connections to those resource professionals that can help you, to the programs that can help you do practices, making sure that you're doing things that are going to help your woodlands and not basically spinning your wheels. I don't want people to do practices that aren't going to be successful or turn out well. So we want to make sure that you're doing things everything's well informed and well educated. And the Woodland on a Short course gives you that platform to get a lot of knowledge, make those connections, and really improve your property for whatever you're trying to achieve with it.
And just like you said, even if you don't have property, it would be good for you to come if you're wanting to get
Certainly,
property.
I would certainly
You'd learn more
encourage,
about what you're looking at.
Any aspiring woodland owners,
Exactly.
yes.
So you don't necessarily have to have property.
No
We've had
doubt.
people come that
Yes,
don't have any.
that are
they're
thinking
looking
about
for
it,
property.
right? Yeah, and it's really great to kind of know those connections, and because those people are going to be ahead of the curve,
Right.
right? Once they've got that property, they're going to really be able to kind of jumpstart the management and care of that property because they know where to go, they know who can help them, and they know what's available and what the options are out there.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, great, Billy. Thank you for coming in today and joining us again. We appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad to be here. And again, check us out at www.ukforestry.org. We have a lot of programs and resources for a wide variety of interests. And thank you all for doing the show. It's really great.
If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
Okay, that noise was very high-pitched.
It is a very high-pitched noise, and it's one I walked out of my house this morning and heard 2 or 3 of them going right in my front yard, and that's the brown-headed cowbird.
Okay.
And they're a really common species. They're one of our blackbird species, so when you see those thousands of birds flying around, that species makes up a very large component of those flocks.
Oh, okay.
So they get into these big roosts, and they'll be around people's houses and those kind of things. But they're interesting species for many reasons. One, we see a lot of them. They're around. They do just fine around people in cities and agriculture. But traditionally, they were actually found in grasslands and along wooded edges.
Okay.
And that's really where they kind of are supposed to be. Onset of human development actually allowed them to expand eastward and take over areas they traditionally weren't found. They are one that is not a population in trouble, and actually they somewhat contribute to the declines of many of our species, including 2 endangered species.
Well, how's that?
Well, so it's a how they lay their eggs kind of deal, and their strategy is a parasitic one where the female actually will sit around right about now, right in the spring, and she'll look for birds that are either building their nest, taking nesting materials back, or those that are flying to a nest. And when that bird leaves its nest, she'll go in there and lay an egg in that nest right with those birds' eggs, and then leave. The thought being that their egg will hatch, and most birds will take care of that new egg, even though it's not theirs. And when it hatches, they'll feed it just like they're young and take care of it all the way through. So there's not a whole lot of parental involvement there, and they can go around and lay an egg a day in as many nests as they find.
How many eggs do they lay?
They can lay a lot of eggs, and it's actually one of the things that the females, because they lay so many eggs, they will alter their diet because eggs and eggshells require a lot of calcium. And normally these birds eat a lot of seeds, grass seeds, weed seeds, or forb seeds, which don't have a lot of calcium in it. So they'll actually start looking for things that are higher in calcium, like snails, or even sometimes when they're laying their egg in that nest, they'll eat the other eggs that are in the nest to get the calcium from those eggs.
Oh, my goodness.
So they are not so great if you're the one that's getting picked on.
Right. I could see that. So why is it called a cowbird?
So
And a brown head. Does it have a brown head?
The males do have a black body and a very brown head. The females are a little duller, and they don't have that as a distinguishing feature. Cowbird-wise, that name kind of comes from originally they were found around cows. You can find them
I would
around cows.
assume that,
humid
yes.
So, and part of that is because about 25% of their diet is made up of grasshoppers, beetles, things that when cows are walking around, they scare, and they pick them off.
Okay.
So they have an association with cattle, probably buffalo traditionally, but that's the thought of where the name originally came from.
And what are their size?
They're not very big. To put it in perspective, they're a little smaller than a robin.
Okay.
About 5 inches in size and height. Wingspan's not much more than 10 inches from tip to tip. So they're not very big. Probably even smaller than 10 inches. Probably closer to 8.
Okay. Is there a specific name if there's a group of them, or?
Well, there's not necessarily a name for the group of them because they get in those big flocks, and those flocks will be made up of things like grackles and starlings and cowbirds. So there's a lot of different birds.
So they all hang out together.
Yeah, they all hang out together. There's red-winged blackbirds in there too. But they, all of them have their unique sound, and if it's a flock of very large blackbirds, it's something I like to think of as sounding like an R2-D2, something like this.
Well, that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so it's all those little high-pitched screeches at once.
Right.
Kind of,
It
to
does
me,
sound
sounds a
like-
little bit like R2-D2.
It does. Something out of a movie. It does sound like that.
I mentioned how they'll lay eggs in other birds' nests, and actually, they're not very picky. So for the most part, though, they're going to try to find birds that have eggs that are smaller than their own.
Okay. Why is that?
And that has a lot to do with they don't want the other chicks to be bigger than its own chick, probably.
Oh.
So that when they all hatch, the bigger the chick, the bigger the mouth, and the bigger the mouth gets the food first.
I see.
So that gives them an advantage. However, they'll probably spread them around anyway, and it doesn't necessarily mean they always find eggs that are smaller than their own to lay next to. But that group of species, these birds will lay eggs in upwards of 140 different species of birds' nests.
Oh my goodness! I was going to
They
ask you what
really-
birds they want, but that's quite a bit.
Really not that picky.
They're not picky.
No, and I mentioned that there's 2 endangered species that actually they've taken advantage of enough, the Kirtland's warbler and the black-capped vireo, where they actually have caused extreme declines in that species to where they're in peril now.
Oh goodness!
And some of the management strategies actually in those areas where those species nest is to catch and get rid of cowbirds to help increase nest success.
Yeah. So I guess there's a lot of cowbirds.
There is a lot of cowbirds. There's no shortage of cowbirds for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming in and talking
no
about
problem.
Thank you for joining us today. We have a new show scheduled for summer 2019. You can listen to us live on WRFL Lexington 88.1 FM on Thursdays from 10 a.m. until noon. And at 10 a.m. we'll be playing a new episode. Then at 11 a.m. we'll play a show from our archives. So stay tuned to 2 shows this summer on Thursdays. If you miss our show on Thursdays, you can listen to all of our podcasts on our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.